I think we've all been rushing around, right, trying to keep ahead of things, and it does look like the season is changing. Thanks again for coming, and we may have to compete with the roofers. I know that doesn't work very well when they're working over the nap room for the kids during the week. So maybe they'll keep us all awake tonight, right? Yeah. First of all, let me just take a moment or two to think about what we did last time in review. 3 points. As I have done in the past, although I think I had 5 points on the other occasions. But we, last time, started by looking again a little bit more seriously at the beginning and the end of Romans 9 to 11, where Paul talks about the issue of Israel, faith in Christ, etc., etc. So you can always go back and look at that rather circuitous discussion in Romans 9, 10, and 11. But the upshot, as I said, is that it's hard for me to believe that Paul ever abandoned Judaism. The diagram I had, he simply converted as a result of the Damascus Road from one kind of Jew to another kind of Jew. And there were many different Jewish groups. The second point was when we get into the 2nd century, we get to some of these early church figures who begin to think about what we might call supersessionism. The church replaces the synagogue, the followers of Christ replace Jews in the economy of God's salvation. That was to have enormous consequences. I don't think probably we get beyond anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism yet, but we're clearly moving in that direction. Third, I showed you some maps. And we ended with a map just looking at Gaza. That strip of land, perhaps 20 miles long, the narrowest place, maybe 4 or 5 miles wide, and anywhere from 2 million to 2.4 million, estimates vary, but inhabitants. And then what took place on October 7th or prior to October 7th, and since has, I think, been nothing short of a catastrophe for everybody. On a little lighter note, as I reflected back on the way we finished last time, I was reminded of a colleague I had at Concordia, an African-American Baptist preacher who worked in student affairs, and he had been an Air Force chaplain as well along the way, but he was at Concordia for many, many years. And where we had chapel, there was always a clock in the back of the room. One day I came in and I saw that Walt was going to be preaching in chapel this day. And I also noticed that they had put up some curtains and to disguise some tables and so on and so forth. But the net effect of this was to block the clock. So Walt had been preaching for some time, and as a good African-American Baptist, he was getting on a roll. And right in the middle, he stopped and he said, "You know, it's very dangerous to put a black Baptist preacher in the pulpit who can't see the clock." Well, last week, I'm clearly not a black Baptist preacher. And I must confess, I could see the clock. I kept you anyway. It won't happen again, okay? We are going to change it up just a little bit on this next session, which I've entitled The Blessing and Curse of Memory, Israel and Palestine's Dilemma. This is an abbreviated version of something of one of the chapters in this book. And it is in a section in that book dealing with the many facets or aspects of memory. And this business of the blessing and curse of memory really emerged out of a sabbatical I had for a portion of a sabbatical, spending the summer months in Israel and Palestine. And I'm going to just work my way through this a bit. We'll keep questions maybe and comments until the end of this, and you can see what you think. After that, we finish that. I want to conclude. I asked the question on that syllabus sheet, what then are we to do in light of all of this that we have been talking about, anti-Semitism, and relating this to the whole issue of Israel and Palestine in light of the horrific events of the last 10 months, I guess, 11 months. And I am going to steal an expression, David, from an article you sent me called double consciousness. And I will make a few remarks. I'll try to be as blunt as I can be, BJ, about this, because we've got two things we're going to have to keep in our minds at the same time. Okay? The blessing and the curse of memory. Israel and Palestine's dilemma. The blessing and curse of memory have been driven home to me very powerfully by two experiences. As with many baby boomers, many of you perhaps, I've dealt with aging parents. And in the case of my father, a parent who suffered from Alzheimer's disease. What began for him as a mild case of memory loss and confusion developed into a full-fledged case of unrecognition, disorientation, punctuated only briefly by brief moments of lucidity, probably more hoped for among those of us who sat at his bedside than her reality. The person I knew and remember was gone. At most, life became a series of disconnected events in the present, only often a matter of seconds with no remembrance of the past to give shape to his immediate surroundings, and no ability to imagine a future. The thread of memory that had woven his life together vanished. Without the blessing of memory, he existed with the curse of forgetfulness. Unable to function socially, he was psychologically and physically dependent. While on sabbatical in Israel, I interviewed a Palestinian Muslim woman about her recollections of her family history, their struggles during the past decades, and how that shaped her view of the situation in Israel and Palestine to that point. She spoke with surprising equanimity about having to flee Jerusalem with her family to her uncle's home in Damascus during the 1948 war, fully expecting to return within a couple of weeks. She said to me, "I still recall my father saying to my mother not to pack too many things, for they would be gone only a short time." 2 years later, they were able to go back to Jerusalem, only to move into a very modest, rundown home. At that point, she said, we knew we were refugees. But it was when she began to speak to me about her house, a home she and her family had fled more than 50 years before, probably closer to 60 years before, to which she still had the key, that she became animated and impassioned. For her, this symbolized the injustice that had been done to her and her people. So powerful was this image and this injustice that she had recently hired a film company to make a film of the house, still standing, now occupied by Israeli immigrants. She would send it to other family members, presumably to keep the memory alive of this deeply heartfelt injustice. To forget the house was tantamount to forgetting the injustice. And the memory of that injustice was what informed her sense of identity and solidarity as a Palestinian. The inability to remember seems self-evidently problematic to us. Unable to remember, my father could not function as an independent person. Without a sense of history and culture, a society cannot long maintain a sense of identity either. Not to remember the injustices, not to remember those injustices of the past, seems like a betrayal of one's ancestors, perhaps even the principles that ought to underwrite fairness and justice. Many in the Jewish community struggle mightily not to forget the victims and horrors of the Holocaust. Mark Ellis, a provocative Jewish theologian and powerful voice for peace for Palestinians, justice for Palestinians, has Jews in mind when he states, quote, "If memory is central, the failure to remember is disastrous. More than a momentary lapse of attention or an excusable human failing, the lack of memory is fraught with tremendous anxiety, as it threatens to sever the relationship that is so important to Israel and the world." End quote. In How Societies Remember, Paul Connerton puts the issue more generally. To remember, then, is precisely not to recall events as isolated one-offs. It is to become capable of forming meaningful narrative sequences. In the name of a particular narrative commitment, an attempt is being made to integrate isolated and alien phenomena into a single process. For the Palestinian community and the Jewish community, individually and collectively, the act of remembrance gives sequence, purpose, and texture to existence in present-day Israel or Palestine. Hence, to tamper with memory can be dangerous, for it goes right to the heart of identity. To threaten the received community of a people is indeed an imposition of power, for it calls into question their self-determination and perhaps even their ability to function with the full benefit of a meaningful and integrated past. The simple act of looking at a range of maps in Israel illustrates this tug of war between Arabs and Jews to control memory, to exercise the power to name. Competing names in Arabic and Hebrew exist for many locations. The ability to name is the ability to establish memory, and that is tantamount to the ability to control. We only need to reflect on Genesis 2:19 to 20. They're given the power to name. If a person or a society is deprived of its ability to create and sustain its own version of the past, it is deprived of something close to the heart of what it means to be functionally independent. I think that's true on an individual level. It's true on a social level. Yet as painful as the loss of memory is, the inability to forget can haunt the soul of a society as profoundly. As a guest of what was called in the day the temporary international presence in Hebron, until shortly after my visit there, when they were kicked out, it was an international force of observers who monitored the relationships between Israeli settlers and Arabs in the center of that city, Hebron. I saw firsthand the power of memory to drive people to hatred and violence. Each side, remembering the violence done to their people, was prepared at the least provocation to avenge the wrongs committed even decades before. With automatic weapons at the ready and fingers on the triggers, young yeshiva students roamed the streets under the watchful eye of the Israeli Defense Force contingent stationed there to protect them. Almost 4 soldiers for every settler. And the Arabs were still seething from the anguish of the massacre by Baruch Goldstein, who, years earlier in 1994, entered the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron and opened fire, killing 29 Muslims at prayer. Each new incident of violence and provocation reestablishes the pattern and draws the long list of grievances, some from many, many years before, into the present as if they happened just yesterday. I remember hearing a Jewish rabbi in Jerusalem say, Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, city of peace, has never been a place of peace. It's a place where memories never die. Time is collapsed, you see, and memory is sharpened to the point of governing how the present is to be lived, and the spiral of violence goes on. To those of us outside that collective memory, the situation seems horrifying, if not absurd. And those concerned about peace and justice can only long for just a touch of amnesia. To those on the inside, one can only assume that the state of affairs seems quite reasonable. Not to remember, not to avenge is the first step to showing weakness and becoming a victim yet again. Tit for tat. Does that sound like a commentary on the Middle East today? I hope you don't have your pagers with you. Not to remember, not to remember is the first step of showing weakness. So the act of remembering and the willingness to act on that memory is thought to be necessary for survival itself. And there may be some truth to that, lots of truth to that. In the world of these people, there is no room to forget, let alone to forgive, for at the end of that path lies separation from the land, sacred to both Jews and Muslims, and perhaps even extinction. In that highly charged atmosphere, a loss of memory could be fatal. Now, a vivid sense of history and an active memory, to be sure, leads only a relatively few people to violence. The Palestinian woman who still has the keys to the house she fled over 60 years prior, and the Jewish couple who have turned their house in Ramlah, a house built and inhabited by an Arab family until they were forced to flee, into an open house for Israeli and Arab school children, have chosen a very different path to act upon their memory. An intense memory filled with a sense of conflicting claims of justice are honored and nurtured in this land where memories never die by some people. Why one chooses the path of peace and the other the path of violence may be a conundrum to us. It certainly is to me. But an active memory is the fuel that has sustained both. And that memory is often shaped by religious narratives, theological claims that govern people's lives in that part of the world. The theological claim, taken literally by ultra-Orthodox Jews, and apparently by other Israelis as well, that God gave this piece of real estate at the eastern end of the Mediterranean to the Jews into perpetuity, is a powerful idea. David Horowitz reports a story, perhaps legendary, about a member of a British commission trying to figure out how to deal with Palestine when the Brits had had enough and were ready to go home. David Ben-Gurion was asked what right the Jews had to this land. David Ben-Gurion supposedly took a copy of Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures, and setting it before them replied, "This is my right." This idea, of course, stands as an affront to Christian and Muslim Arabs who also call this land home. Mark Ellis again identifies the dilemma. Memory, of course, is problematic. Memory can be a force for justice, but it can also be deceptive, even treacherous. Memory has rooted the Jewish people throughout history, especially in the years of the exile and suffering. But the role of memory in contemporary Jewish life is deeply problematic. He's speaking here as a Jew. The dangers of memory, with their forms on exclusivity and chosenness, have traditionally coexisted with its possibilities, a sense of the relationship with God and the protection of God within suffering. Contemporary Jewish life, however, especially after emancipation in Europe, the Holocaust and the birth of Israel, has taken a bifurcated character. These competing memories of entitlement lead to contention over territory, which is seen most poignantly in Jerusalem, El-Quds, where opposing groups seem to contend for virtually every square inch. Memories run deep in this land where theological claims intrude into space and time. And that means that religious convictions and political expediency are invariably linked in Israel and Palestine. Even among the more secular people, the respective religious traditions leave an imprint on their collective memory. And that has made it so difficult, indeed intractable, since 1948, and even before, for the political leaders on all sides to enter into agreements that appear to contradict the historic sensibilities of their people, even when the more immediate security requirements could be met. I remember vividly, on another occasion, getting on an Arab bus to go into Jerusalem city center near the old city from where I was staying. And I purposely got on an Arab bus. I didn't want to ride in a Jewish bus because it was at that point, many of them were being blown up. And I didn't think I'd be in jeopardy riding an Arab bus. It just so happened that at this time, Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, was still alive, and he had been spending time with the Israeli prime minister at Camp David. It was at the very end of Bill Clinton's presidency. And Bill Clinton had every incentive to try, before he left office, to get some sort of agreement. And in the run-up, as this was going on for a week, 2 weeks, or whatever it was, many, many days, and I was reading the press, I realized that Yasser Arafat, had he signed on to anything, would come back and he would be a dead man. And it was just during the end of this, I get on I hadn't even heard the news yet, but I get on this bus, and it's all, they have a radio, all in Arabic. You know, I pick out a word here or there, but I could tell what had happened. The talks at Camp David had fallen through, and Yasser Arafat was on his way home, never having signed anything. And there was a palpable sigh of relief on the part of that bus full of Arab folk. They understood from their point of view, if he had signed that, that would make official and fully ratify what they felt, and indeed, in many cases, what had happened to them. In their frame of reference, a thoroughgoing injustice. It's one thing to have it sort of nebulous out here, it's another thing to have it fully ratified. Remaking one's understanding of the past to account for present circumstances can be a complicated and painful process. So difficult that some people will go to great lengths, if they have the means, to try to bend circumstances of the present to conform to their vision of the past. When you hear many Israelis talk about what we might call the West Bank, or what Palestinians are apt to call the occupied territories, they will refer to Judea and Samaria. Well, that goes back a long time. They may even resort to violence as they hearken back to some vision of history. At the same time, their memory of the past is subtly revised, even dramatically in some cases, to provide a mythic rationale for their current social and political situation. Maybe also to provide justification for their actions. The contour of a people's collective memory is fluid, and to forestall a form of cultural schizophrenia, memory must be adaptable to the realities of the present as well as the society's hopes and fears for the future. This is the stuff of which national myths are made. In the case of the Israelis, the so-called Masada myth. You know, Masada is this freestanding mountain up above the Dead Sea, where a handful of Jews, after the temple had been destroyed, took refuge there and held the Romans off for a long, long time. Now, the history of it is a little bit murky at points, maybe even contested, but the myth has a reality. It has compelled many Israelis to prepare to defend the nation to the death, just as those Jews of old faced down the overwhelming power of Rome. This, along with the experience of the Holocaust, undergirds the nation's security system, which not only defends the Jews, but diminishes the Arab self-respect at every border and checkpoint and in every confrontation with Israeli military might. Maybe I mentioned this to you before, but this hasn't been that long ago, was visiting some Palestinian friends in Bethlehem. And the wife, Carmen, was born in Jerusalem. She has a right to go from Bethlehem into Jerusalem, go through the checkpoint. Her husband does not, because he was not born in Jerusalem. But she wanted to go into Jerusalem, and she pleaded with me to drive. She said, "It will take us a lot longer if I'm driving." And sure enough, I drive, they look around, wave us through. I've seen other situations where it's not that way for Palestinians. Bringing, you see, conflicting memories and myths into some form of equilibrium where coexistence is possible is the elusive goal that some well-meaning Israelis and Palestinians are still trying to achieve. That article that Carol duplicated by David Schulman, I think David Schulman, an Israeli peace activist, puts his life on the line all the time in Hebron and in the West Bank. The Israelis are still trying to achieve some sort of equilibrium, even as the effort is made much more complicated by the latest convulsions of violence to befall the region. Failure to do so will consign future generations to continued outbursts of carnage, where one violent act becomes the excuse for the next. The spiral of unrelenting retaliation hardly seems an appealing future for either group of people and their yet-to-be-born children. Memory and the stories that give shape to memory, history and religion being prime examples of these kinds of stories, are the filters that structure how we look at the world and our place in the world. Unfortunately, in our modern vocabulary, when the word myth comes up, it's simply a reference to something that's false. Myths are much more complicated, much more fulsome, and powerful than that. We Americans are highly mythological. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All are created equal, or all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among those the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's a myth, folks. I personally happen to be committed to this myth, despite the fact that slaves, were 3/5 of a person. Women couldn't vote. Only male property owners. In our history, the beauty of this myth is that our history in this country has been a process of trying to become a more perfect union in light of those ideals. Without those ideals, who knows where we would have been? We all lived through the civil rights era of the 60s. Well, you were close enough to be infected with the notion. Now, while Jews and Christians and Muslims agree that the land is holy, they disagree profoundly about what makes it holy and what it means for the present. Is it holy because it is the land promised by God to the people of Israel, the land of milk and honey? Is it holy because it is the land of Jesus' life, ministry, and death? Or is it holy because it contains the noble sanctuary, the place from which Muhammad ascended into heaven? Probably the third most holy site in all of Islam. These claims might be innocuous enough were it not for the fact that historically the heirs of these memories also lay claim to the land and try to exercise control over it in the name of their own religious and historic memory. When this becomes the attitude, the drive for peaceful coexistence among Jews and Arabs is forced into a dead end, where the competing claims are reduced to who has the most power. For many of us non-Jews, to call the strip of land in the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea the Holy Land is a rather quaint way of connecting us to the heritage that informs our religious faith. Modern Western Christians, for example, may go on pilgrimage to the holy site, but in no real sense does this normally entail a direct sense of entitlement or franchise to the ownership of the land. Now, if we wanted to see a bit of a quasi-exception to this, we could look at American Christian Zionists. We would run over tonight if we were going to take up that topic as well. Visiting the sacred sites may spark religious devotion, but not territorial entitlement. For many Israelis, however, the connection between what it means to be a Jew and the land of Israel is direct and it is palpable. In the ideology of Zionism, the one has come to be linked to the other. Each drop of blood spilled in defense of the land, and each drop of sweat that soaks into the soil to make it produce reconfirms the right to possess the land as one's own. What once may have been given by God, the people now earn by the sweat of their brows and the ingenuity of their minds. Though the pioneer spirit of modern Israel has receded, the legacy of entitlement continues to grow stronger even among more secular Jews. Only now, for most Israelis, it is based on what the Jews themselves have made of this land that once was arid, marginally productive, and relatively backward. Possession of the land is their just due, to be vigorously defended by force if necessary, and relinquished only at great cost. The perennial contradiction running through the ideology of Israel, modern Israel, is the notion that it can be a Jewish state on the one hand and a modern democracy on the other. To be sure, there are many Arabs who are citizens of Israel. But the idea that a critical mass of Jews must constitute the state still prevails. This notion also makes the leaders of Israel wary of allowing Palestinian diaspora folks to return to the land in any significant numbers. To control demographics, whether by immigration or birth rate, is critical to controlling the land. Since Israel wields enormous power, it can control immigration to its advantage, although they have a problem. Now, there aren't all that many global Jewish folk to immigrate back to Israel, or who want to. What Israel cannot control is the birth rate differential between Arabs and Jews. So, if you Google in the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, how many Jews and how many Arabs are there? You may get different answers, but any number you get is going to be a highly politicized number. But somewhere, it's pretty close to even. And the Israeli government, for obvious reason, is not inclined to simply absorb all those Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan or wherever and make them citizens. There may be, if that were the case, there may even be more Arabs than Jews. And how can it be a Jewish state? But the Arab birth rate is much higher than the Israeli birth rate. Now, I don't know if demographics are destiny or not, but you can see the problem. And the problem goes back to the 1967 war and the victory of Israel. But now it had all these Arab folks to account for one way or another. So there is an underlying fear among many Israelis that they will simply be overwhelmed by the Arab masses. And that fear runs deep. In the life cycle of a society, the power to remember and, when called for, the power not to remember are both necessary for long-term social health. The ability to shape constructive memory is a blessing, without which meaningful life is not possible. Yet the ability to subdue and reconstruct memory may also be virtues of great value. What we are able to remember is important, but how we remember is also important. Memory is a complex attribute of human life, and whether it is the memory of an individual or the collective memory of a people, left unexamined, it has the power to exercise a devastating tyranny. Some may say that memory is simply memory and has no particular value judgments attached to it. Often this may be true, but not always. Some memories and some ways of constructing memory need to be re-examined and critiqued for the way they contribute to human beings' ability to live constructively and humanely with other human beings. Nowhere is this more true than in the Middle East. Short of that, Israelis and Palestinians may simply consign themselves to further spirals of violence that threaten the survival of all sides in the dispute. During the violence of the past decades, it appears as though the collective memory of these two peoples has become so focused, so narrowed, perhaps even fixated, that the conflict shows signs of degenerating into what can only be described as a blood feud. The tragic irony of a feud is that remembering and forgetting are fused in strange and violent ways. The feuding parties remember with single-minded, white-hot intensity the hatred of the other. At least that much they remember, and it consumes their social consciousness. But it seems, in the broader sense at least, to the outsider, that intense remembering has driven from their collective consciousness the precise reasons why they hate the other so much. Other than that, it has been that way for as long as anybody can remember. The hatred risks becoming primal, reflexive, and unrelenting. The long series of symbols and sites of earlier violations and victimizations on both sides overlay each other and finally collapse into a preoccupation with the most recent atrocity, whether that be in Beit Jala, or Ben Yehuda Street, or Tel Aviv, or Hebron, or on a settlement bypass road, or Gaza. The loop of memory is pulled so tightly that it is difficult to break through to disrupt the pattern of self-destruction and interject an element of external realism into the quarrel. The social psychology of this feud at the present seems to be frustratingly impervious to outside protestation. And I say this in spite of the events of September 11th, which may have papered over some of the causes of the conflict, but most certainly have not resolved them. Now it seems that raw power has become its own justification. And when that doesn't seem to work, as apparently it didn't in Gaza, simply try more of it, more brutally than before. And global powers often stand quietly, if not passively, by. For my octogenarian father, debilitated by the disorienting effects of Alzheimer's disease, the loss of his memory was the final stage of his life before death. In the mysterious processes of his mind, he had forgotten most of what he once remembered. In Israel and Palestine, a region of the world where so much of the past is stubbornly refused to die, people continue to die for the sake of the past and their own machinations in the present. On all sides in the present conflict, what appears to be most alive is fear. And this fear sharpens the senses in ways that many of us in recent America, until September 11th, could only imagine. While the tears of grieving people continue to flow in Gaza, Nablus, Jenin, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Tel Aviv, they are now joined by the tears of those who remember loved ones in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. And as we have seen, they have been joined by the tears of many more innocent people as death has come to Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Ukraine. Memory is a fickle friend to us. And as necessary as it is for life, it often seems to walk hand in hand with death. I am not presumptuous enough to think that this is all there is to say about the world of the Middle East, relationship between Jews and Arabs and Palestinians, Muslims, and so on and so forth. But I think it is one strand that helps us understand why this conflict is so intractable. So intractable. Okay, what are we sitting half the world away, yet having that world from far away brought into our living rooms on TVs or on our phones on the internet or whatever? How are we? What are we to think and do? I happen to think that there are diplomatic folks in various parts of the world who have given for decades their best shot at dealing with this. I happen to think that President Biden, while he may have gotten out ahead of his skis at the beginning, has tried his level best to bring some sort of ceasefire. No luck so far. So what are we to do in light of all this? Here's where I come to this issue of double consciousness. I think we, wherever we are, whether we're in Kalispell or any place else in the world, need to combat anti-Semitism with everything and all the power we have and wherever we find it. You don't need to watch too much news to see how it's risen its ugly head. Not that it was ever completely gone or not expressed in one place or another, but it is out there. And it's entangled with racism, and it's entangled with religion in one way or another. But I think it's incumbent upon us, if we take our own traditions here seriously, to know something about the history in the past, and remember who Jesus and Paul were, how the church got off the beam, and maybe since the Holocaust, we've tried to think through that in more helpful ways in the modern era. But it's still there. Whenever you hear the terms Christian nationalism, I would even go so far as to say when you hear the terms white nationalism. I don't think this is a Christian country. It's a country that has a lot of Christians in it, but a lot of other folks as well. Neo-Nazis march in Charlottesville, Virginia, home of the University of Virginia, one of the eminent universities in this country. And one young woman died. We've got to keep this in our consciousness as one of the things and be attuned to where anti-Semitism may rear its ugly head. And I don't see how we in our tradition could not take it seriously and do everything that we might be able to do to combat it. The other side of this double consciousness is supporting the rights of all people, Palestinians included, whether they be Christian or Muslim, to realize their aspirations for freedom and dignity, whatever form that may take. Personally, I gave up on the two-state solution in about 2005. The policy of this government is still a two-state solution. If not a two-state solution, I'm not creative and imaginative enough to imagine how this might work out, whereby Palestinians and Israelis could live not merely side by side, but together. Now, I think some of you know, when I get back to Portland, I'm going to be thinking about one particular strand, more seriously again, of religious extremism. Religious extremism, political extremism, extremism writ large can be a problem. I would say most often is. The only kind of extremism I think in our tradition that might not be a problem is treating your neighbor as yourself. I just picked up a new book about 3 days ago by Timothy Snyder. Yale historian, on freedom. And he makes the case, and I don't think this is an accident, that freedom is not just freedom from. You could read Paul, it's freedom for. Timothy Snyder talks about freedom to be the full realizations of ourselves. And so, I think being sensitive and doing what we can to stand for a thoughtful kind of theological reflection that is serious-minded and not just knee-jerk extreme. So, I realize that kind of brings us to an opportunity for any sort of discussion. Questions, comments, ideas. As I said, I have tried to cut this back for our purposes here and not run over time and leave some time for comments and questions. Becky.
So, what's the relationship between Israel, Lebanon, Hezbollah? Where did that start or come?
No, it's... The question is, how did all this stuff, Hezbollah, Hamas, Yemen, the Houthis, the Iranians? Well, the modern era could go back to, 1978 or 1979? Scott, some of us in here are old enough to remember firsthand when President Jimmy Carter hosted the Shah of Iran in the late 70s.
I remember that guy.
And the Shah, through some machinations of the Americans and the British, was installed in power after World War II. And the Shah of Iran, he was not a kind of cuddly sort of guy. His secret police were pretty rough, and they kept the lid on for quite a while. And I can remember Jimmy Carter toasting at a state dinner the Shah of Iran and waxing eloquent about what a friend the Shah was to the United States and how we were close allies. It wasn't very many months, and the Shah was chased out and replaced by Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, what you may or may not fully appreciate is that Iran is overwhelmingly Shiite Muslim, the Shia. Traditionally, the Shiites have been passionate about their faith and mystical in many ways, but they were living under Sunnis in many countries, under the control, and they didn't really have aspirations to control the government like many Sunnis did, until Ayatollah Khomeini came along. He changed things and began to articulate a whole political theory and system of Iranian religious control through the Ayatollahs and mullahs and so on and so forth, in imposing a theocracy, if you will. Well, they, took some of our hostages from the embassy and held them for a while, and Ronald Reagan took the oath of office. What was it like? At something like 12 noon. At 12:01, the Iranians released the hostages. And probably led to the election of Ronald Reagan and the defeat of Jimmy Carter. Now, I'm staying on your question, but we got to have a little continuity here. Academics take things that can be relatively simple and complicate them. But this is complicated in its own right. We, the Americans, have been at loggerheads, if not actually war, but loggerheads with the Iranians ever since. No diplomatic relations, so on and so forth. But Iran has felt like it needed to spread its Shia Islamic ideology. And what is their chosen course of action? It is these proxies. These non-state groups which they train and fund. Hezbollah is one in Lebanon. Hamas, it may be more Sunni than Shia, but they're getting Gulf money, if not Iranian money. And Iran supports the Houthis in Yemen. Figure it out. If you're an Israeli general or politician, they're starting to surround you. Just like the Israelis are with Jerusalem. It's hard for me to believe that our diplomats and military people were ignorant of this when we went into Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein. I don't suppose any of us here have any love for Saddam Hussein, or as George H.W. Bush would say, Saddam. But somebody had to know that a huge proportion of the Iraqi population is Shiite. And they have a lot of affinity to the Iranian Shiites. So we get in there, and we had been led to believe that the Iraqis would be so thrilled that they would meet our soldiers with flowers and signs of welcome. They may have on the first few days, but it didn't last very long. And we got bogged down. Surprise, surprise. Am I making any progress, Becky, on how they all fit together here? I am, how should I say it? Because of the extremism all the way around, I am, for the first time, I think, not particularly sanguine about the state of Israel's existence long term.
So was Lebanon there before Israel was formed? Or?
Well, the French controlled it. They called it the Levant. And it's religiously very diverse. A lot of Christian folks, different groups. But you see, Hezbollah, Muslims have moved in, and as a weak state, Lebanon couldn't do much about it. And, how many years? 25 years ago, Israel went into into Lebanon and tried to clean it out. Well, that didn't work particularly well either. So it's basically an unstable region. And Hezbollah, the Party of God, has, at least what you read, apparently thousands of these rockets that can reach the northern third, if not the northern half, of the state of Israel. Scott.
I was going to ask a different question or comment or ask about kind of which countries in the region are pro-Israel or anti-Israel. Let's go with that. What do we? I mean, Egypt has been kind of famously anti-Israel at some points in time, but at other times has chosen to try and find a way to support a state of Israel. What are the other countries in the region doing? And I know Iran, like you say, is obviously famously anti-Israel.
Yeah. Well, I think the surrounding Arab countries, I think Egypt was the first to acknowledge and sponsored by the U.S., a treaty arrangement. The Sinai Peninsula went back to Egypt. Not Gaza, but the Sinai Peninsula. But I think I've mentioned to you before that Anwar Sadat, a very sophisticated leader, military man, followed Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and Sadat sought to make peace under the auspices of the United States with Israel, which they did. And of course, and here's the important point, he was gunned down at a military parade by his own soldiers. So, whether it's Egypt or any other country, what the leadership does and what the sentiment of the populace in general is may be quite different. Now, Jordan, King Hussein and now King, what's his son's name?
Is it Hussein?
Abdullah, maybe.
Abdullah, yeah.
Yeah, it's King Abdullah, his son. Very pro-Western, but they are sitting on a majority of their population which are Palestinian. And they have agreed to some sort of treaty with Israel as well, but they have a tightrope to walk for the same reason. Now, under Donald Trump, they were trying to get the Abraham Accords with some Gulf states, and it looked like that might be going somewhere. I don't know where it is now. But all of those countries, too, Gulf states, have mixed Sunni, Shiite populations.
That's Saudi Arabia.
Well, Saudi Arabia is a special case. The Gulf states, the little ones, Saudi Arabia has its own problems. They have some Shiites, too. But they have their own brand of Islam, which was a kind of an unholy bargain between Prince Ibn Saud and the modern kingdom that has now played itself out. We'll let you run the religious realm, which is extremely conservative, and you stay out of politics and we'll do this. But it's it's a kind of a tough balance. I think the Gulf states, those small, exceedingly wealthy Gulf states, because of oil, have walked a tightrope because of their own populations, and they at sometimes have been exceedingly anti-Iran. But do they want to get too close to the United States or Israel, in fact? So you have this, these unholy equilibriums or disequilibriums playing themselves out there all the while. And it seems like this country has wanted, for the last three administrations, wanted to turn its attention to Asia, but we can't seem to quite get out of the Middle East. And we are committed to the right of Israel to exist. I personally think Israel has a right to exist. But that means certain things, and if we can't, we've long ceased to be honest brokers, I think. This country has. The Palestinians, Arabs, certainly don't think we're honest brokers. Linda.
I heard you say a magic word, oil. And the U.S. is, it's very sad to me. We're like an awkward big kid, desperately trying to get some people in the Middle East to like us so we can have the oil.
Yeah, and the irony today is, Linda, we don't need their oil, apparently.
And the other irony is the more we supported Israel, maybe many people had different reasons why they supported Israel, but a major reason for the U.S. to support Israel is they would be our friend there.
Well, and I think yes, I think you're right. That one of the major reasons we would have a friendly outpost in that part of the world. And I think, from whatever you read, there's close collaboration between U.S. intelligence and military and Israeli intelligence and military. I mean, I have no idea, but you get up and you read in this morning about the pagers that blew up. Israel's not saying a word. The U.S. is saying it was Israel. And so we're intermeshed.
But our friendship with Israel is not, now more than ever, makes us unpopular with the rest of the it's not an easy relationship. Sherry?
So, Jim, earlier you said that in your opinion, you don't think the two-state solution is viable or achievable. And so I want to just make sure that I'm understanding, when you say a two-state solution, you're talking about a religious state, religious government system, not a system where we're supposed to have in our country, where our religion is not part of our government.
No, I'm not talking about a religious government. And I'm not even talking about a religious state, even though that's the way it would shake out. Arabs in that area, historically have been both Muslims and Christians. The Christian population has exited that area for decades. You can go to Michigan and see a lot of Arabs who have migrated, and some have stayed, which means that the proportion of the Arab population is more and more Muslim, and Israelis, although there are Arab citizens of Israel, would be considered Jewish, whether practicing or not. Ethnically Jewish. Why I think the two-state solution is really difficult for me to imagine, well, maybe I just don't have enough imagination, I'm not sure, but is that the settlements have continued to flow. And now you have the bypass roads that only settlers can use, Palestinians can't, and you have so much of what would be a Palestinian state changed by the facts on the ground. So when you try to take a handful of settlers out of Gaza in 2005, and there's hell to pay for the government, imagine going into the West Bank and trying that. It would be impossible. So, where are the Palestinians going to go? Where would they have a state? I know Palestinians who say, we just love to be citizens of Israel. Why don't they just welcome us and we'll try to be productive and so on and so forth? Well, we have the memory problems. We have about the time that in the 80s and 90s when the Israelis and Arabs were talking, what so often happened was that at the point where they were getting close to maybe some serious agreements, some violent spasm of violence would take place, and it would suck the middle out of the political, social center.
And people's memories and...
All of it. Yes, right.
This has been going on since the end of the 19th century. So there's not going to be a very quick solution. So I have a 100-year solution. Edward Said in 1979 wrote a beautiful book, an article about the condition of Palestinian people that confined territory. And he said that they were never, Palestinians would call themselves what they are. The Jews would never call them Palestinians, they'd always just call them non-Jews. So everybody in there is a non-Jew if you're a Palestinian. And so the thing I would recommend is once almost the terrorist type of government in Israel removes itself, and there could be a condition where people could actually start calling them who they are and try to create a new memory. Now, I'm an idealist, but it's going to take 100 years.
I don't know if this made it into this presentation tonight, but in the article, there is an Israeli historian from the Negev, the desert down by the south, who says, if people, human beings, never sort of compromised or changed their memory and mythology and so on, we would have long since obliterated each other. He argues that there's a kind of pragmatic thing that can hopefully come into place, and you go down this road, we're all going to be dead. We go over here, we might have a chance. Over 100 years or two, maybe. 200 years, yeah. David mentions Edward Said. English prof, as I remember, became a kind of a giant of an intellectual with regard to the Arabs and Palestinians or whatever. Taught at Columbia University much of his life. And he came to be known for a word, Orientalism. The way we look at that part of the world and construct our vision of Orientalism, which may not bear much resemblance to how they see themselves or not. But I think it's true. And I kind of touched on this. If you call this village by a Hebrew name or a Arabic name, is really an act of asserting some sort of control, power. All the power in the big picture is on the side of the Israelis at this point. Beth.
I have to go back to what you say about the fear that the Israelites think that the Arabs are having more babies. So then that's the rationale for targeting hospitals that have children in them and orphanages that have children in them. It's all based on fear?
Well, I think it's fear. I don't necessarily want to say that the Israeli Defense Forces say, there's a hospital in Gaza, we're going after it just because it's a hospital that has babies in it. It could be, but I don't go there.
See, it makes me feel really, really sad that our tax dollars are going for rockets that are killing
Yeah.
children, and that they're not letting any food or water get into people.
Oh, it's a problem. I suspect in the machinations of the Israeli Defense Force, they see themselves as going after Hamas members. Now, Dr. Aageson.
I think the IDF is going after Hamas, which is not a military. It's a terrorist organization that hides among civilians, and they have lots and lots of evidence now, corroborated by U.S. intelligence and Israeli military, that the tunnels, the armaments, everything, right in the schools, right in the hospitals. And so, no, they are not targeting civilian areas, to target civilian areas. They're leafleting to tell people to leave, which Hamas doesn't do. They're telling them to go to a safe place, which Hamas did not build for them. They're not allowed down in the tunnels as shelters. There is nowhere for the Gazans to go. And so I think we have to be very careful the way we interpret the actions of the Israeli military, because they are fighting a war. Hamas, they don't wear uniforms. They don't fight according to the international rules of law. And they'll murder their own civilians if they think they have anything to do with the Israelis. If you are considered to be a collaborator, Hamas will kill you. They live in absolute terror of Hamas, and they live in terror of the Israeli army coming. And these people, yes, it's horrible what's happening, but they are really caught between a rock and a hard place. And if you believe that Israel has a right to defend itself, then this is the price that will be paid. Now, what you see going on is Sinwar, who is a complete and total zealot, and admits he doesn't care how many Palestinians die, as long as he achieves the destruction of Israel. And then you've got Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who are zealots on the opposite side, saying, we're going to do this to the end, and we don't care what it does to Israel. So Israel is very much in an existential war for its own existence right now, which I agree with Jim, that in a year there may be no Israel. To answer your question about why we support them, they're the only democracy in the Middle East. And it is the job of this democracy to support the little democracy in the Middle East, because there are no others. No others. And that is always, even back to the 6-Day War, that was why we supported Israel.
Yeah, it is. What happens in these proxies, Iranian proxies, is at best an asymmetric kind of resistance. In fact, I think Netanyahu and others will refer to the axis of resistance, these proxies, resistance to Israel. Again, our time is up, and I'm not going to keep you, but I do think we have to leave here, hopefully, with this double consciousness reinforced. Anti-Semitism must be resisted. I think by anybody, but certainly if you're a Christian. And ferret out where it may be hiding, even if only obscurely hiding. And at the same time, I do believe that people in this country, wherever in the globe, including Arabs in that part of the world, ought to have a right to a just and hopefully peaceful and secure life. How do we get there? I'm sorry, I can't give you the answer to that. If I could, I'd be a rich man, I have a hunch. I really appreciate you coming. I appreciate your thoughtfulness and your ideas. And I get to walk around. Unfortunately, most of you have to sit. Thanks for coming.